Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Lung Cancer Living Room. So happy to have all of you in the room. Those of you watching online, those of you who will come back and watch online post-live, welcome, welcome, welcome. So tonight, as you guys may or may not have known, what we are talking about is clinical trials and innovative clinical trial designs. We really, want the objectives of tonight are to demystify clinical trials. I've talked to a lot of you in the past who have concerns about what a clinical trial is, what it means, what that might look like for you, when, who's running these clinical trials, when should I consider a clinical trial, how are they designed, what do the different phases mean? There's a lot of, I think, questions that come too. So we're really hoping, and I know that by the end of this evening's program, there will be a better understanding of what that looks like. So tonight, we have with us Dr. Karen Reckamp from Cedars-Sinai Cancer Director Division of Medical Oncology. She's the Associate Director of Clinical Research, Clinical Professor, Department of Medicine, Study Chair at Pragmatica Lung, and Co-Chair of LungMap. Keep those two sort of things in mind because they're very interesting clinical trial designs that I think a lot of people don't know about. Some hopefully do. And then we have with us Judy Johnson from SWOG Cancer Research Network Lung Committee Patient Advocate. So she is your voice on the Southwest Oncology Group, which is a cooperative group, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what that means as we go on too. And then, of course, for those of you who are familiar with this program, Andrew Ciupek, who's Go-To Associate Director of Clinical Research. I know that a lot of people might not know this, but not everybody has the benefit of being seen at a Cedars or down the street here at a Stanford or up the street at UCSF or a large academic center or even a large cancer center, right, where most of these clinical trials are happening. And so the work that Andrew and the Lung Match team do is to help identify patients, particularly patients in more sort of rural areas who don't have access to clinical trials based on what their sort of criteria is, right? Because a lot of times the healthcare providers won't even discuss a clinical trial because it's 50 or 60 miles away, and it's maybe the person they're talking to has an aunt or a sister 50, 60 miles away, right? And so what the work that happens through Lung Match, I think, is really critical. So with that, let's jump in. Great. So in the spirit of demystifying clinical trials, let's talk a little bit about what a clinical trial is. They're not always drug trials, right?
No, so a trial can be really anything that we study, and we think about patient-oriented clinical trials, so that these are things that interact with the patient. And it can be anything from a blood test or any kind of biosample. We're doing a lot with microbiome, so it even goes to things like our stool that we collect. And sometimes that's over periods of time, and you can be a part of that trial and also part of a treatment trial. There are things looking at diagnostics. We've had big studies looking at screening. CT screening for smokers is something that helps to cure more patients with lung cancer. So screening trials, prevention. At our institution, we do a lot of diet trials for prevention and prevention of symptoms. And then what we talk about probably the most is treatment trials. But the treatment trials also can be at any time of the cancer diagnosis. And so again, we can do things for prevention for somebody who doesn't have cancer. We don't have a lot of those types of trials in lung cancer at this moment in time. We just heard at our big ASCO meeting 2 weeks ago about interventions for early stage, what we call neoadjuvant before someone goes to surgery, or adjuvant after someone goes to surgery, to help cure more people with lung cancer. And then the typical trials, which are treatment trials in the more advanced stage, where we're often learning about new drugs or comparing them to the standard of care type of treatment, trying always to improve our treatments for patients and help outcomes to be better and quality of life to be better.
So when we're talking specific to drug trials, they're phased, right? So what does that look like? Just high level. I know it's complicated, but.
So, I mean, in general, a phase 1 trial is a trial where we're looking at a drug where we don't know that much about. And I think the important thing to know is that the primary objective of that trial is to look at the side effects and to see how safe it is. In non-cancer, those are done in healthy people. In cancer, they can only be done in cancer patients who have had all the treatments that are available. And so helping the cancer is kind of a secondary. We are always hoping for that, and all the drugs that we got to, immunotherapy, targeted therapies, have all gone through phase 1 testing, but the primary purpose is to look at side effects. Sometimes we're combining 2 drugs in a phase 1 trial, so we may know more about what those drugs do and how they work in lung cancer and how safe they are. And so that may be a little bit safer or a little bit more known to go into a phase 1 trial that has known medications or known drugs in other diseases. We just haven't tested them in lung cancer. But a first-in-human phase 1 trial, sometimes they're starting at very low doses. So if you go in and you're the very first person in that phase 1 trial, you may get a dose that's not, it may be the drug is good, but the dose you get is not the right dose yet. And so they're dose finding and they're looking at side effects. Phase 2 is that middle ground. And sometimes they're trying to understand how well a drug works, what we call efficacy. But sometimes it's compared to another standard. Sometimes they do it at multiple doses, but it's usually a smaller trial looking to see if there's a signal. And then phase 3 tend to be large trials and tend to be what we consider kind of the definitive, what you hear randomized, sometimes placebo-controlled, but in the US in this day and age, placebo-controlled doesn't mean you're not getting treatment. It means you're getting a standard of care treatment. And knowing that we don't know which one is better, most of the time that standard of care is the better option. Everybody wants the new option, but that's not always the case. So generally they're randomized, and that means that you're going in saying, I'm willing to get either treatment here. And so that's generally how a phase 3 trial is run, but we're really looking to make sure that it is better than the standard of care, and then it has implications for getting FDA approved and things like that.
I think it's important to reiterate what you said about getting standard of care therapy versus study drug therapy, because I think this is one of those sort of continued misunderstandings out there that people do think they're getting the placebo or a sugar pill, or basically no treatment versus a maybe drug treatment. So I think that is something that is really important to point out. And when we talk about dosing, is sometimes there are and you don't hear about this, but almost like a phase 4 sort of version of a trial. What does that mean? And that's usually, well, I'm going to let you.
So phase 4 is usually what we call post-marketing. So the drug has gotten some approval by the FDA, but they want to learn more. Often it's in cancer drugs, especially targeted therapy, it's often a food effect. And so they want to see, well, all of the people got it without food. And we find sometimes the toxicity is actually more when people take it on an empty stomach. So they do a food effect and they take it with food and they do some tests. There are often lots of blood tests and things like that involved. Or post-marketing to just study some specific side effects or get a better idea of what those side effects are. Some of the best examples are the COX-2 inhibitors, which are not for cancer, but the cardiac effects and things like that. So they want to do extra studies. But we know that the drugs are approved, the drugs have efficacy, they've gotten through the bars of the FDA, and now we're studying different aspects of those drugs. There are trials where we use just different combinations of drugs we know a lot about, and we look at novel ways of looking at those, but we have a little bit more knowledge about what these drugs are. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about those when we talk about novel designs.
When drugs aren't approved here but are approved elsewhere, then what? And I see heads nodding.
I think we're seeing more of this, but the X396 is a good example, and who knows what will evolve. But there's a lot of things involved in getting drugs approved. And obviously, when you have a company that is a for-profit company or a company that is trying to put these drugs out there, there's a lot that goes into it before it even goes into a person. And they're trying to keep this, what we call research and development, R&D, moving along. And so generally, the US market is kind of the gold standard, but more and more other regulatory bodies in Asia and Europe have a little bit different criteria, even for for the number of patients with, their type of race and ethnicity involved. And the U.S. is starting to think about that a little bit more, looking at, so we're not just taking trials that have everybody in China and say, okay, we'll approve this drug. So there's a lot of complicated regulatory pieces that go into why a drug is or isn't approved. And where I think the U.S. was always the place where everybody wanted it approved, they're now looking at angles across the world as avenues, even if the U.S. is not the market where they can make it into. And I don't know if Andrew has any insights into this aspect of clinical trial development or drug development.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we can see a lot of different clinical trial designs. I mean, we're seeing more clinical trials being done internationally. I've seen clinical trials open sites both in the United States and Europe and Asia, and often, there are multiple countries being done at the same time. But I also think we're seeing, where in the past a lot of clinical trials might have been done in the U.S. and then opened internationally or other things, we're starting to see clinical trials done in other countries first, and sometimes that actually makes a lot of sense. Like a great example is for patients with EGFR mutations in their lung cancer tumor. A lot of the research that's coming out for clinical trials with EGFR has sometimes started in China, and there's a really good reason for that, and that's that people of Asian descent, lung cancer patients, tend to have higher rates of developing an EGFR mutation. So in countries like China, it's a very big issue to their patient population because they tend to have more patients with EGFR mutations. And a great example of that is that we saw at the most recent ASCO meeting, where there was data being presented from the Wukong series of clinical trials that started in China with a new EGFR inhibitor called sunvozertinib. And we're actually seeing that with the early phase clinical trials, they started in China, but as we learned more about those drugs, they're starting to open clinical trial sites in the United States. So sometimes things are, eventually gain broader access as we start to understand them and go through. And some of the positive developments I've seen is that we're thinking more of lung cancer and cancer in general as a global community. And, while it's not always possible because of things that Dr. Reckamp mentioned of different regulatory bodies and different rules in different countries, there is a thought about how can we make, global access more available to patients no matter where they start. And so, just because a clinical trial is being done in one place, it may eventually open sites in another country to develop. And that's one of the things that we always have discussions with people about.
Judy, does any of this play a role in your participation, like this information? What role might it play in your participation with the SWOG?
I guess the thing that strikes me about it is, since everything is becoming more global, and one of the outcomes of the pandemic that was positive is that there was so much information shared via Zoom all over the world. I mean, people could participate in these conferences and learn about all of this research who could never do that before because there was not a virtual option. So I have learned so much about research all over the world that gives me the information I need to step back and think about the trials that we're designing at the SWOG Cancer Research Network, and just think about how this will impact the patient and what more can we do in the future as we continue to collaborate globally.
So I want to jump into the variety of individuals and organizations that actually run clinical trials. Can we touch on that a little bit? And then I want to finish up with SWOG and take a little bit deeper dive into what the cooperative groups look like.
So since Judy talked about the cooperative groups, so cooperative groups, I don't know when they started, maybe in the 70s or 80s, kind of as the war on cancer started in the 70s, and cancer centers and all of that. That's kind of when these groups started to come together. But the cooperative groups tend to do trials. So these are trials, and it's evolved over time. So there are multiple cooperative groups. Judy and I come from the SWOG, which is the Southwest Oncology Group. There's ECOG, there's ECOG Akron, and there's Alliance, and There's NRG, which is generally more the radiation oncology trials, and the gynecologic oncology has merged with one of the groups. And so there are lots of different groups that span the country and come together usually to ask big questions and how do we get to, broad populations, mostly across the U.S. There are some international examples, but it's mostly across the U.S. and across all disease type, and from, early detection to screening to early stage to late stage. And we tend to ask questions that probably the industry partners aren't as willing to put money behind to ask those questions. And so often some of the good examples that we have in our lung group now are sequencing of things like immunotherapy, because all of the immunotherapy, we have probably 10 or so different combinations or agents or combinations of agents that can be used as immunotherapy as the first line for advanced non-small cell lung cancer, and all of which have been shown to be better than chemo, but none of which have been compared to each other. And so we all sit and we give you information, and we're giving you the best information we have, but we don't have that information. So there's always these subtle questions that are not going to make anybody more money in the drug industry if we answer them. And so those are the types of questions we tend to try to answer. Or we have a trial called the lung map trial, which we do genetic testing on all patients, and that tends to match people to sub-trials. And so that's another way, when there are small subsets and we're gathering patients from around the country, that's a good way to do that. So that's generally what the NCTN or the cooperative groups do. And now the way they work is that all trials basically can be accessed by anybody who's within those groups. And these are groups that can be anything from rural to at academic institutions. So they are a way for people to get access to trials. It's probably not going to be the most novel therapy. So the industry trials are really generally the trials with the most novel therapies. And those have a lot of rules associated with them, a lot of screening, a lot of testing that needs to get done, and are some of our most complicated trials, but obviously developing drugs that they want to move into the marketplace and move it in rapidly. So the time frames can be a little bit different. And then there are foundations and institutions that run trials. We have investigator-initiated trials. Most institutions will run investigator-initiated trials that are sometimes a combination of either donors or foundations or even industry helping to fund those trials. And again, there are also trials that we do that we're just taking blood or biosamples that we're trying to understand diseases a little better. But generally, the key piece of doing some research is getting funding. So we can have a great question and moving it forward. And when we're talking about drugs, so if I want to do, some of the hardest ones I talk about, we do diet studies at our institution. Those are generally funded by the National Cancer Institute and things like that, because industry is not going to fund those types of trials. And sometimes, you think about vitamins or things like that, and chemo prevention. Those are very hard to get funded through industry because they're generally not drugs that get marketed in that same way. And so, so the funding piece is a key part and a very early part of what we're thinking about for clinical trials. Right now, we're thinking about a clinical trial in SWOG about how to give targeted radiation for what we call oligo, or when a single site or two sites progress, how to give radiation and how to test for residual cancer in the blood. And so as we're trying to do that, there's no drug involved. And so that's the complicated part. And so we had a meeting today that we were putting our heads together, like, how do we get this funded? Sometimes our foundation partners, our patient advocates, sometimes they come up with ideas for how to creatively do this.
Yeah, interesting. Andrew, Judy, do you guys have anything to add?
The clinical trials that are offered by the National Clinical Trials Network are able to be accessed by more people and within more communities. And the communities have difficulty running trials sometimes. unless they've got support. So I think that it's important to be able to offer these trials that industry isn't able to or won't fund, to give access to more diverse populations.
Andrew, do you have anything to add?
I think it's great with both Dr. Reckamp and Judy talking about the different ways that different groups have come in and done clinical trials, and I think I'm seeing a lot more of a focus on doing clinical trials in new and innovative ways to reach more patients. In addition to the cooperative groups and other things, we're seeing organizations get involved in clinical trials for the first time. I mean, a great example is the work GoTo does in partnership with Alchemy or the Dario Lung Cancer Medical Institute. They're an international consortium of research partners that really tries to make sure clinical trials can open faster with agreements and get to patients faster among their partners. But they also really focus on how we can bring clinical trials more directly to patients with what we call decentralized designs. And these are things that can either be done at a local clinic or, in fact, sometimes even bringing things like blood collection and other things directly to patients at their home. And that's been really great in doing different kinds of studies that wouldn't, again, like Dr. Reckamp said, wouldn't get necessarily done by a company who's interested in testing a drug or a treatment. And two great examples are the Spark study that Alchemy's been working on, which is really looking at collecting blood and other samples from ALK-positive patients who are on an approved ALK inhibitor right now, like adagrasib or sotorasib, and then understanding maybe if those drugs were to ever stop working, what happened to cause them to stop working, and how can we inform future KRAS inhibitors that can help patients, and also things like the Young Lung study that Alchemy is doing, which is looking at a thing we've noticed where there's increasing numbers of younger patients without traditional risk factors who've developed lung cancer, and collecting blood and other samples from them and having them answer questionnaires to understand what's contributing to increasing rates of lung cancer. So these, prevention questions as well can be answered. And so, there's a lot of groups out there that are trying to think of clinical trials in different ways to really help answer questions that are important to the community.
Thank you both. So one more sort of design question. Clinical trials are designed differently, right? There's single arm, there's basket trials, there's umbrella trials. Can you explain the difference in these trials?
So I think we talked about some of these, but a single arm trial is obviously you're going to get this drug, so similar to what you experienced. And I think for a patient, it's the easiest one to get your head around, like there's no other question. And then again, and then the randomized trial where it could be one of generally 2 or 3 arms. Usually it's not more than 3 arms for a randomized trial, but you don't get to choose. And so you're putting your name in the hat, and whatever arm they pick is what you get. And so those are the kind of the 2 most standard. Sometimes there are multiple arms, but they're using the investigational drug at multiple doses. So you still know you're going to get that investigational drug. And then the basket trial, so the nomenclature, a basket trial tends to be, so like an example of ALK, that you do ALK in multiple different tumor types, and they all get the drug, but you study the tumor types separately so you can understand that. And so there are many of these rare alterations that happen in many tumors, and ALK is one of them. And so you can do a basket trial, and you put it all in the basket for ALK. And then an umbrella trial is kind of, I guess, what we think of the opposite. So it's covering, so it's generally lung cancer, but maybe testing multiple lines, different combinations, different dosing, and and sometimes they call them octopus because they get really unwieldy and put their tentacles out everywhere. Some of the early immunotherapy trials or some of the KRAS trials have been like that, and they start adding different, and some of the KRAS trials have been kind of basket and umbrella, where they're doing multiple combinations, but also across many different tumor types. So it's going across the top and the bottom. But those tend to be complicated trials, but they're looking at smaller populations. They tend to not be randomized trials. They tend to be smaller trials, trying to get signals of what kind of combinations are working, or whether these alterations are important and kind of driver alterations across multiple tumor types.
We talked a little bit about lung map. Do we want to talk a little bit about Pragmatica?
Sure. Pragmatica is kind of the thing we've been working on for about a year now, but I have to say, I'm happy to say that it is actually open. So it's called Pragmatica Lung, and it is based on a trial we did through SWOG and Lung Map. So this Lung Map is a trial that looks at genetic biomarkers and puts people in matched sub-studies or unmatched. So we had an unmatched sub-study that looked at immunotherapy and something called ramucirumab, and the combination of those, and we compared it to standard of care. So it was a phase 2 randomized trial with 2 arms, but it was a smaller trial. So the signal was that we had an improved survival using that combination therapy, but basically, most people who looked at it said this wasn't big enough for me to say this is the new standard of care. And so sometimes when we have a very small population, you can't do a big randomized phase 3 trial, but this is in people who have had immunotherapy, had some response, and then had tumor grow on that immunotherapy. And so there's lots of people who fit that criteria, and so a bigger trial needed to be done. The 2 drugs are Keytruda and Cyramza, or pembrolizumab and ramucirumab, which are drugs that are approved across many tumor types and have been given to thousands, maybe even millions of patients with cancer. And they're both approved in lung cancer for various populations. So we know a lot about these drugs. So we know, and the safety profile doesn't really overlap, and we know from the phase 2 trial that the toxicity that we saw was really about what we would expect. So we know a lot about these drugs. We know that it improved overall survival in a smaller study, and it's also 2 drugs from 2 different drug companies. So how are we going to move this forward? And so because we had this mechanism through our cooperative group setting, and we had buy-in from the FDA, from CTEP, from the NCI, and everybody's thinking, how do we make trials more patient-friendly? How do we get more diversity in our trials? The timing was prime. So we had, at our June meeting last year at ASCO, we presented the data from the phase 2 trial, and almost immediately after that meeting, or even before, we're thinking about how we're going to move this forward. It really didn't seem like we were going to move forward because it wasn't as interesting to the drug companies to get together to move a large phase 3 trial forward. But because other groups were involved and felt it was important, and this is a partnership across multiple cancer entities, foundations, Friends of Cancer Research. I mean, we had lots of groups involved who said this is important, and it's important to move forward. So we had a number of calls, and they said, and the FDA and the NCI are already thinking about pragmatic trials. So this was kind of the example of how to have a pragmatic trial, because we have drugs that are safe. We have an endpoint that we know, survival. So when we are looking at survival, we don't need to get the nitty-gritty of a lot of scans and a lot of blood tests or things like that, because we know. And we're using standard of care based on what people would get normally as the control arm. And so we took everything out of this trial that wasn't necessary. And we kept the focus on what are our questions? What is survival, and are we making sure this is still safe for people? And so we're collecting the highest level side effects and unexpected side effects, not the side effects you can read about in the package insert and what we know, but unexpected, and survival. So we don't even require scans. I mean, everybody will get scans, but they will get done totally as standard of care. And so in this trial, there are very few things, and so it helps two ways. There are no labs that need to be drawn. You draw your labs as you normally would in standard of care. So the rural sites, the harder to reach sites, it's easy for them to do this with their patients. And we get questions all the time. Where are the labs? How do I know if my patient is eligible? And if you would do this in your practice, this is what it is. And the work that our staff has to do. So post-COVID, we're all struggling with getting people back to work in the same way that really, and at least at academic sites, we have lost a lot of people because when you take care of patients, you gotta be there. You really can't be remote, at least not all the time. And so we lose people to lots of other jobs where they can be remote and they're more satisfied that way. So we have less staff than we used to have, and we're dealing with new changes, and so the staff is less burdened because we're not collecting all these things. And then the piece of it on a trial is once you collect the data, there's somebody in the background looking at data saying, is that correct? So all the data points you have, the more data points you have, the more that have to be what we call audited, and so the staff has to respond to that. So on every aspect, the burden is reduced, from patients to staff to everybody. This trial opened in March, and I don't know the number today, but in 3 months period, we have about 40 patients, which is unheard of, and that because sites are opening over time, and there's still many sites that haven't opened, but even in the last month, we entered 20 patients. So this is a trial that can get patients on it. And again, with the buy-in with the FDA and this is a new way of thinking about it. We've had so many, our industry partners are saying, we have to collect this, we have to do this. And even the FDA is saying, no, you don't. We're gonna keep it simple. So it is a test. It is a test to see if this can work. But for the right drugs, we're not going to do this for drugs where we don't know the side effects. We want to keep our patients safe. But for the right drugs, for the right scenario, people are thinking about this. And then that's where Judy comes in, because we kept a pulse with Judy for this study from the very beginning. And I don't know, from your perspective, Judy, if you could describe your experience. And I will tell you, I was uncomfortable all along the way because we kept taking things out. And that's not how we run trials. Are very prescriptive in what we need to do. And so the more we took out, the more it makes us all like we're looking for our training wheels and we don't have them. So I'd love to hear Judy's perspective.
Well, all I can say is I'm so excited about it because, as we have acknowledged, patients are the highest priority. And if we can't get them on clinical trials that they can complete safely and help the site run those studies without too much burden, then we can't answer the questions that need to be answered. And like Dr. Reckamp said, to have 42 patients, and I just checked this today, enrolled in 3 months, that's unbelievable. That is just amazing. And I think that many of them are in the community hospital setting, which means more people who could not enroll on those studies can now do so because they're accessible, because the treatments are out there, they're standard, they're approved, they're available. So I can't tell you how excited I am about this trial. It's really awesome, and I'm just happy to be working with the whole team on it.
I love the work that you do on behalf of all patients to help make clinical trials more accessible to everyone. And I hope that people in the room and those watching, with the examples that Dr. Reckamp just walked through and Judy and Andrew have spoken to, this is definitely not the era of your grandfather's clinical trials, right? Or your great-grandfather's clinical trials. Your voices are being heard. People are listening. And the community as a whole is really trying their best to make these types of trials more accessible to you. So what I want to ask Dr. Reckamp next is, who and when should someone consider a clinical trial?
Everyone and always is kind of from a investigator perspective and a person who has been in the lung cancer research arena for 20 years. I want to study everything about everybody if I can. And so the simple things like blood collections or tissue or things like that, if that works for you, those things are easy to do. For treatment clinical trials, you should always consider it, but it's not always the right time. We go through phases of studies being opened. You know, the ALK inhibitors, the timing was kind of perfect for the X396, it sounds like, but sometimes it's not the right time. And it had alectinib been available, that might have been the right next drug for you, but obviously it wasn't. But that, if that was on the market, that might have been the simplest thing to do. So it's really is a conversation with your physician, but also if you're in more of a community setting where they're not talking about trials, asking that question and potentially getting a referral to a bigger institution. And now, at least mostly in state, we can do virtual visits and things like that. So I even in LA, I do virtual visits sometimes with people from Northern California or things like that, just to talk about it, because it's a relatively small world, even internationally. And so as these new drugs are coming down, it may not be the right time now, but there may be some opening in the future. And so thinking about it kind of all the time, but I do think you need a guide. When you have a specific alteration, then the online forums are very good. If you don't have a alteration and you have more of a general lung cancer, sometimes you need a guide. And so that's where I think Andrew and his group are very, very helpful, because if you look up clinicaltrials.gov on your own, you could be there for days, and it's like a labyrinth. Every trial is so exquisitely specific. You know, if you've had this many therapies, it may not be for you, and so you really have to have guides to help you through it. So the Go-To Foundation is really helpful, and having advocacy and having those types of groups can be very helpful. But ultimately, connecting with a physician who can have that conversation with you too can be helpful too. And I think there are a lot more ways for people to get that, even if they're not. If it's not accessible, you know, to drive there or to get there in person.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Having those shared decision conversations with your healthcare providers is such an important thing, but it's also important that you're educated on your disease when you're having those conversations. And I think that's where the lung match team, and I want Andrew to speak around the biomarker testing results coming to the patients, because I know you and others from science and research and support services have been in conversations with diagnostic companies about how those results are reported back out and how confusing they might be to patients as well. So what role does lung match play there?
What access to information are you going to get? And if there's a test being done as part of the clinical trial, what information are you going to receive, and understand the difference between what Dr. Reckamp was saying earlier, which is, are there experimental tests going on? Are there, regular standard tests that you're going to receive? And it's just part of the decision-making process about a clinical trial. But a lot of this is kind of confusing and trying to sort through, what the different aspects of clinical trials are. So that's where, finding a partner is always a good thing. A lot of the resources out there, you definitely start with your doctor and asking about clinical trials there. And there's a lot of great resources. There's online patient groups that were mentioned earlier that have really started to help put together information about clinical trials and share their experiences on clinical trials. But adding into that, a lot of advocacy organizations, including Go-To, have tried to help be that partner, to look more at clinical trials. And that's where Lung Match comes into play. And so basically, Lung Match is an opportunity to call in and connect to someone like myself or other people on Go-To staff who have a background in research and are helping you translate what clinical research options are good for you. So we help do clinical trial searches, as mentioned before. When you look at clinicaltrials.gov, which is kind of the main Google or search engine for clinical trials, it can often return back a lot of results. It's hard to narrow it down. The information was written really for the researchers, not really a patient-level language. And so, taking from the 100 results you might get there and get down to the 2 or 3 that might be really worth asking about your doctor, that's what we help with. What are some good questions you can ask at your next appointment, about real relevant clinical trial results and making the best use of your time. We just try to cut down the time and sort through all the stuff that's out there so that, you are prepared to go that conversation more easily with your provider. And, that's a great, one match is, a great resource to have. And, just having it in the toolbox is like a lot of those other things that were mentioned before can potentially be a real help, because it does take a lot of effort to understand, what make that decision.
Thanks, Andrew. So as we're wrapping up, I think what I'd like to do is ask the panelists for any final thoughts or take-home points you'd like to reiterate. Judy, do you want to start?
Sure. I think one of the things I've learned is really important to collaborate with organizations like GoTo, Longevity, and some of the smaller roots organizations like EGFR Resistors, AOK, KRAS. I've met many people through Andrew and others that have built my knowledge and helped me do a better job as a lung cancer patient advocate. So I think my takeaway is collaborate, work with others, use resources like Lung Match, and just be fully informed.
I think, everything that everybody shared here today has, just been spot on. I think, if I had to do a takeaway message, it's that whenever you really face a treatment decision or a decision about your care, there's an opportunity to have a discussion about clinical trials and find out what's there at that point in time. But that can be a big undertaking. You just, all the stuff we've heard today about the different types of clinical trials, different way things are getting done, that can be a lot to sort through. Just know that there are resources out there. There's things like, organizations that were mentioned, One Match, other organizations, the patient groups, connecting with each other. This is it kind of, as Judy mentioned, there's kind of a whole lung cancer community that's trying to work on, making clinical trials more better for patients and helping people sort their information out there. And so I would say, don't hesitate to have that conversation with your provider, with others, about how clinical trials might fit in and, whether or not it's a great decision for you, because there's a lot to sort out there. And it's a process, but there's people who are willing to kind of, help.
I've been a part of this transformation of lung cancer. When I was in training, we thought of lung cancer as non-small cell and small cell. And since that time, because I've been in lung cancer research, I have been a part of this transformation of lung cancer into multiple diseases, into people with early stage and late stage living longer, being treated as individual people. And I see this big word hope, like the hope of what's in lung cancer is drastically different today than it was 20 years ago, and that's because of clinical research. And so I don't know what comes 20 years from now, but the clinical research will be an essential part. And every years that we go by makes cancer, lung cancer, a livable disease. And sometimes when people now ask me about their prognosis, even people with advanced disease when they get diagnosed, most of the time my answer is I don't really know. One example is a patient who actually never went on a trial, but benefited from every point in the way, was diagnosed back in 2009 before we knew a lot about, we knew about EGFR, maybe we knew about ALK. I think she was tested for ALK on a trial, trying to get in a trial, all negative. We gave this person an EGFR inhibitor at one point because EGFR inhibitors were approved for everybody. They weren't just approved for people with EGFR mutation. It did not work, but this person had benefit to initial therapies. And then we found a BRAF mutation and benefited from BRAF therapy that was being developed in melanoma, and then got onto immunotherapy, which was spectacular and had 100% PD-L1 and lived with lung cancer because of what we found in trials, and not a person who had a driver from the beginning of that diagnosis. So there is a lot of new research going on. We're learning from lung cancer, we're learning from other diseases, we're getting better at treating it, and the better you do with any therapy, the more likely you are to get to that next breakthrough. And so we appreciate your engagement. You're all here and engaged, and we appreciate that. But I've seen the benefits, and it is fully worthwhile.
From the very beginning, my saying has always been, all you have to do is live long enough to get the next best thing. All you got to do is live long enough to get the next best thing. I've been saying this for 8.5 years, and so far it's working great. So all you do, live long enough to get the next best thing. And
the choice is always yours. So one thing that I always say to patients when they're signing up for a trial, it is voluntary. So if it's not working for you, the choice is always yours. As much as the investigator or your physician may be invested in it and want you to do it, the choice is yours. So don't lose sight of the power that you have in that relationship, because this is your life and your cancer, and each step of the way you're in charge.
That's great, thank you. Thank you all for your participation, and I think not only tonight, but thank you to those of you who have and or are considering participating in clinical trials. I know Dr. Reckamp just said it, but I don't think you all are thanked enough, because it is true. The last 20 years have been an incredible time for discovery for this disease, and that wasn't the case for a half century before that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We don't just need funding, right? We need people. So if you guys have questions, if anyone has questions and wants to learn more about clinical trials or the process, please reach out to our Lung Match team. They'll be happy to talk you through things that we discussed tonight, and can help guide you towards questions to ask your healthcare providers about the possibility of you participating. I am going to say thank you to our panel. Thank you all for coming here today and having this very important conversation. We couldn't do this programming without you guys either. So thank you very much. Our supporters, I would be remiss in not thanking them. So it's a long list. Amgen, AstraZeneca, Boehringer, Ingelheim, Bristol Myers Squibb, Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai, Foundation Medicine, Genentech, Janssen Oncology, Merck, Mirati Therapeutics, Novartis, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda. That's a long list because they recognize that this type of programming matters to keep you all abreast of what's going on too. So thank you all so much, and we will see you next month.
So I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're